Welcome to today's presentation on integrated pest management and plant healthcare. This presentation is going to be split into two halves just to make it a little more tolerable. First, let's describe integrated pest management. Integrated pest management, or IPM, uses a system approach to reduce pest damage to tolerable levels through a variety of techniques, including using natural predators and parasites, genetically resistant hosts, environmental modifications, and when absolutely necessary, chemical pesticides. Most of the time, IPM strategies are going to first rely upon biological defenses, physical and mechanical defenses, before we use chemicals to alter the environment. This is just a little diagram showing many of the different sections of integrated pest management, and you can also look at it as something that you do all year long. This diagram is for typical agriculture, where we might start at planting and work our way all through the year, but it includes many things that happen at the same time. They don't necessarily happen in separate windows. It's something we're thinking about all the time, from when we start preparing the soil in a landscape, we're thinking about the site, planting the proper materials, having understanding on what pests are coming in or moving through the area, trapping pests for monitoring purposes or to pull them out of the environment, looking at damage thresholds, using cultural controls, biological controls, chemical controls, and then keeping good records, making sure that we know what's worked and what hasn't worked and what we might need to do in the future. Integrated pest management is based on a few key things. One of the big ones is taking preventive measures to prevent pests from becoming problems in the landscape, and monitoring the crop. In this case, our crop are trees or landscape plants. And so monitoring them to make sure that they are healthy and having an understanding of what kinds of pests are bothering them. If there are pests, we're going to assess the level of pest damage. If it warrants action, we're going to choose the most appropriate actions based on the level of the pest and the level of the damage. And just as a reminder, we use many different tactics in IPM: cultural practices, biological control, chemical pesticides, pest-resistant varieties, as well as physical barriers. So why do we need to talk about integrated pest management? This might seem like the only system that you know. And nowadays, it is quite common for people to use an integrated pest management system. But 30 years ago, and really starting in the 40s and 50s, 1940s and 1950s, when chemical pesticides first really showed up on the scene, people were using them to just wipe out every single insect or disease that was coming their way, use excess quantities of pesticides, and we had a number of pesticides that really weren't very good for the environment. As we began to have a better understanding of what pesticides were, or chemical pesticides were, and how they should most effectively be used, this idea of integrated pest management, of having an understanding of biology before we apply just any management practice, will have a more successful outcome. And so why do we use IPM? One of the things is really we want to keep that balanced ecosystem. When we go out and just dump chemicals, they can kill things that we don't necessarily want to kill. There are beneficial insects, beneficial fungus, all sorts of things that if we remove every potential thing in that category from the environment of our plants are actually going to suffer. And so we want to have a balanced ecosystem. Also, pesticides are not always effective. Certain insects and a few diseases can be controlled very easily with pesticides, but many diseases and some of our insects cannot be. And so applying a pesticide in those situations is just not going to work and will be a waste of money. Integrated pest management is not difficult. Often it's cheaper, see the next bullet, and it doesn't take any more time. It's just something that we have to think about. It can save us money. Chemical pesticides are often quite expensive. And a lot of the other practices that we use with IPM can be much cheaper. It can also promote a healthy environment. And so not only do we want to keep a balanced ecosystem, we can leave the environment just as good or maybe a little bit better if we use proper IPM. It can also help maintain a good public image. And this is important for arboriculture companies or landscape companies that are selling services. And even many of the companies that traditionally used a lot of chemicals have kind of switched their tone. So we used to have a company called ChemLawn, which went around and sprayed people's lawns for all sorts of weeds. And they've changed the name of their company to remove the chemical part of the name. I can't think of it at the moment, but it's something like Green Lawn now. And so we don't have this negative connotation of just dumping pesticides in the environment. So how does IPM and plant healthcare fit together? We've had an introduction to the concepts involved with plant healthcare, but we haven't defined it as an actual thing. And plant healthcare is something that is specific to arboriculture and woody plant management. And it takes IPM and really shifts it to look at woody plants in the landscape. And so PHC, or plant healthcare, is a holistic and comprehensive program to manage the health, structure, and appearance of plants in the landscape. Most of the time when we talk about IPM, we're looking at short-term agricultural crops, not necessarily long-term woody plants that are going to be in the landscape. And with a lot of our IPM crops, things like the way they look and what people think about them isn't important, but for plant healthcare it is. And so looking at the structure and appearance and the health of the plants is just as important. Plant healthcare is the wise observation, assessment, and environmental and ecologically sound prescription of recommendations for maintaining vigorous landscapes and plant communities. Really what we're doing is considering the whole tree in relation to its growing environment over its entire life. Plant healthcare brings together site and plant selection, which we'll talk about in our following presentations in the next couple weeks, site preparation, planting and early care, managing nutrient, water, and aeration levels, pruning, we're going to monitor plant performance in the landscape, includes pest management, preventing or moderating plant problems, and as well, you have to have a knowledge of the lifespan of the plant and the potential problems that they're dealing with. And so it's really more than just having an understanding of what the problems are and how they might affect the plant in the landscape, because we have all these other things that come into play when we deal with woody plants and trees in the landscape. If we use plant health care, we'll have some positive results. We should have improved landscape performance and function, increased efficiency and effectiveness of maintenance, preservation of existing plants versus having to remove them and replace them. And then we also have opportunities to serve clients in the planning, development, and maintenance phases of their landscapes. And so we have a business opportunity for commercial arborists and landscapers to sell services besides just prunings and cleanups, and even besides just coming in and spraying or treating, but helping homeowners be proactive in the management of their landscapes. One of the biggest industries at the moment, I shouldn't say biggest industry, but a big component of plant health care is really looking at the soil and amending the soil and fixing the soil and relieving compaction and adding biological and organic components to the soil with the idea that all these benefits to the soil will translate into better tree health. And especially in urban areas where we have really poor soils, you think of trees on tree lawns or in parking lot medians where there's just, compacted soil and harsh conditions, and adding some of these biologically based components to the soil can potentially really increase the health of the plant. And so there's a lot of research and interest in this aspect of plant health care going on now, and it's relatively new. Probably within the last 10 years, it's really taken off. For us to be good practitioners of integrated pest management and plant health care, we have to be familiar with the IPM principles. The first one is pest identification. We have to have a good understanding of the biology of the pest species. We have to know not only the phases of its life cycle, the timing, if it's an insect, how long is it in the egg stage? How long is it a larva? When does it go into pupa? When does it emerge as an adult? Which of those life stages is it vulnerable to management in? Oftentimes, many insects are protected in the egg stage, but vulnerable as larvae. But if those larvae are inside the tree, I may not be able to get to them. And so I might have to wait until the adult stage is out. And so having an understanding of when life stages are around, which life stage causes damage, and at which life stage I might be able to manage it is important. I also need to be able to monitor and assess pest numbers and damage. And so if I have one boring beetle, that might be enough to manage. But if I have one leaf-feeding caterpillar, probably not. And so having an understanding of how many before there's a problem and how much damage those insects cause, or fungus, or salt, or environmental stress, monitoring to know how many are around, and assessing the impact and the damage and deciding when I need to take action is an important part of IPM. We create thresholds. Ideally, we try to prevent pest problems. This is easier said than done, but the best way to do this is through maintaining good plant health. And so preventing excessive drought situations by mulching around the bases of trees, preventing damage from weed whackers and lawnmowers. Keeping trees healthy can really help prevent many pest problems. And then understanding how to use a combination of treatments to fight whatever the pest is. So using biological, cultural, mechanical, and then maybe chemical management tools. And again, that chemical management tools are going to be used really as a last resort. After we've decided that we need to take some kind of action, we need to figure out how severe the situation is to determine which control methods we will use. And so there's a few questions we need to answer. The first one is, how damaging is the species? Is the species just going to cause a little bit of damage, or is it going to eat every leaf off of my tree and all the rest of the trees in the neighborhood? How big is the infestation? Is it just in one person's yard? Is it the whole neighborhood? Is it the town? Is it statewide? What scale are we looking at? And how bad is the infestation? Maybe it's something that's common throughout the state, and we have one instance here in someone's yard, but there's not a lot of it everywhere. It's just a little bit here and a little bit there. But if we have a lot of it everywhere, that might make us use different techniques. We also need to think about how sensitive the site or the host is. And so is that tree particularly rare for some reason or endangered? Is the site a wetlands on really erodible soil? And so we need to think about what we are protecting and how what we might try as a control method might affect either the host tree or the site. And so let me give you a couple examples. And I'm going to use native insects because when we talk about invasive insects, the damage level is high all the time. So if we look at the forest tent caterpillar, which is a defoliating insect, it chews the leaves of trees. One of its favorite hosts is the sugar maple. And it's a cyclical pest, so we see it every 10 to 15 years we have problems with it, but it's around kind of all of the time. And so some of the time, the forest tent caterpillar feeding on a tree is no big deal. If I see a few of them around, I might make note of it just so I can keep record of how many I'm seeing, but I'm not going to take any kind of action. When we have outbreaks of the forest tent caterpillar and they're feeding on every single sugar maple in a 5-county area, then I might need to do something. And that's going to be a much more widespread solution versus maybe just one tree here and one tree there. But you start to see a lot of people take action. And there's things we can do to individual trees. We can put this kind of sticky tape around them and catch the caterpillars as they walk up and down the tree. And that's relatively effective. We can also do aerial spraying, which is also effective, but much more costly. We can manage forest trees with aerial sprays. And so the number of trees, the amount of insect, that's all going to weigh in on what I'm doing. How sensitive is the site and the host? If we have certain areas that rely on those plants being there, I might be sure to treat those areas first before some other areas that aren't as critical. Let's have an overview of the components of integrated pest management. There are 8 components of integrated pest management. For the remainder of this presentation, I'll go over a few of them, and then the controls will be in the following presentation. The first one is prevention, and I've mentioned this a little bit already, but I just want to review. A healthy tree will go a long way to preventing pest problems and a diverse landscape. And so a healthy tree, a tree that is growing well, has the ability to defend itself from insect attack, from disease problems, withstand some environmental stressors. And a healthy tree is not only growing outwardly, but also inwardly, thickening its cell walls, building chemicals for defense. These are all things that are important in a healthy tree. Making sure the trees aren't suffering from drought, protecting them from physical damage. Those two things really can help keep a tree healthy. A diverse landscape can also be important. And it's not necessarily going to prevent disease in all the trees, or I should say it's not going to prevent disease in one tree, but it might minimize the amount of disease or insects overall in a site. And you can probably relate this to agriculture, where if you have acres and acres and acres of one particular crop, they're more susceptible to a disease or an insect just killing everything because it burns through like wildfire. But if we have a diverse population on those acres and acres and acres, maybe only a quarter of the plants die, and the other 3/4 are fine. And so we can apply that to the landscape. And we think about this a lot when we look at urban forestry plantings on streets, where we don't want to have the same tree species on every street in the whole town. This was a hard-learned lesson. In the mid-1900s, many streets were just lined with American elms, these big, majestic trees, canopies that stretched over top of the roads and people's homes. And then Dutch elm disease rolled through and just wiped out the population. And whole streets went from having lots of trees to no trees. Unfortunately, some cities didn't learn quite as quickly, and then they replanted a lot of their streets in ash, or in some cases maple. And so many of those communities are suffering now from emerald ash borer problems, or Asian longhorn beetle problems. And so we want to have a diversity on the street. Try to minimize the number of trees that are all in one family, have a good diversity of trees in different genera, and even different species. And so it's not even just the species, but completely different mix of genetics. And this will help minimize the impact of a disease or insect outbreak on a community. The next principle is scouting and monitoring. And so when we talk about integrated pest management in an agricultural sense, we often talk about it as scouting. And we might even have people whose jobs it is to go out into the fields and count numbers of insects or look for incidents of disease. And we do this a little bit in arboriculture, but it's more of a network where we have people around the state who report back in, and people talk to each other that are working in the field, and we build up the shared knowledge. And so what we want to do is track population numbers, infestation levels. Do we have a little bit of forest ant caterpillar, or do we think that there is a population explosion coming? This can help us prepare. And then we also need to have some thresholds. If I'm out there looking, how do I know when too many is too many? If I see one of something, is that too many? One Asian longhorn beetle is too many, but one forest ant caterpillar is not too many. 100 forest ant caterpillars might be too many. And so we need to have some sort of thresholds beyond which we take action. And so take a look at this picture. This is a linden, and we have some damage. Does anyone know what that damage was caused by? So this is a defoliating insect, and this one in particular is eating on only the leaf tissue between the veins. You can see the vein material left behind. This is Japanese beetle damage. Yay. And so, is this an acceptable level or an unacceptable level of injury? If this was a tree that was your client's, would you recommend that they spray the tree or take some other action to prevent the damage? And so we have to put this into a bigger context because we are seeing just one branch of the larger tree. If this is the only set of leaves that are eaten, the tree's fine. That beetle is not going to cause too much more damage to the tree. There's a lot of leaf area left behind that's photosynthesizing. But say every branch looked like this, where a quarter of the leaves were eaten. That might be problematic. The tree is going to start to suffer. It's not going to be able to produce enough it's not going to have enough photosynthesis to produce enough carbohydrates. So we might need to take action at that point. So we have to decide in each instance, is something acceptable and unacceptable. And so we'll think about it on the landscape level, but also on an individual tree level. And this is where we need to have some knowledge about pests and plant life cycles, and also their natural predators. And so knowing when a pest is going to cause problems, when it's done, the time of year is important. And so thinking about that previous picture, if I saw that kind of damage and it was the end of August, September, I'm not really worried about that. But if that was June, I might be more worried because in theory, those leaves have a lot more work to do. But I also need to know, how long are Japanese beetle adults out? When do they lay eggs and go away? When are their larvae causing damage? And so we need to know those pest life cycles and how they line up with the plants. One concept that I want you to be familiar with is the growing degree day. And this is the relationship between heat accumulation in the environment and pest development. And really what this means is insects, and this is really for insects, insects grow and develop not on a calendar day, but on how much heat each day accumulates. And so we can have early springs and the insects come out early, and we can have late springs and the insects come out late. They're not emerging on any particular day. And we track this by how many degrees above 50 degrees Fahrenheit we have every day, and we add them together. And the relationship has been relatively proven that we can track the development of insects and say, we know when an insect is going to hatch out of an egg, how long it's going to be as a larva, when it's going to go into cocoon, based on these heat accumulation days. And so we pair an understanding of growing degree days with regular scouting to have a relatively good predictive model on when we might see insect problems. There's two links on the screen here, and I'm going to explore the bottom one a little bit more with you. And so we can look up the accumulation of growing degree days and pair that with lists that say, this is when an insect is a problem, this is when you need to treat it based on growing degree days. And so Cornell tracks growing degree days in New York State. And this is the other website, but Cornell's is usually the one that we go to a lot. But so here's the growing degree days for New York. Get my pointer out here. So here we are in the middle of the state, and growing degree days, we usually don't start counting them until April 1st. in New York because we don't have a lot of warm days before then typically. And so this is the map for growing degree days in New York State on April 6th, and this was 2016. And you can see here the key in Madison County, which is this light blue color. We've accumulated about 450 growing degree days to that point, which is actually kind of a lot. We must have had a warm spring that year. And some years you'll pull this up and it'll be 10. But you can see that other parts of the state are warmer and colder, which you probably already knew. So the Adirondacks is colder. You can see they haven't really registered anything yet in this gray color, and white is between 0 and 150. And warmer areas, the Finger Lakes, Ithaca, Hudson Valley, in the green, they're already up at 10,500. And as you go further down, where it's yellow on Long Island, 1,200. And in Pennsylvania, you can see some of the orange. And so this makes sense. More southern areas are warmer. But there's a fair bit of variation even throughout places that are, upstate New York. Here's the growing degree day map for July 6th, a few months later. And so you can see most of the state is in this middle orange range, 1,650, 1,500. The Adirondacks are still cold, 750. They're going to see very different pests in these colder parts than we're going to see in these warmer parts. And so we can track this. The Hudson Valley, this Route 90, the Finger Lakes corridor are going to have pests first before we see them in these kind of rural areas in central New York and western New York. And some of those pests never show up in the Adirondacks because it's just too cold. So this is how we use them. So this is a pest management schedule. And we're looking at growing degree days, this GDD, which is this column here. And I'll come back to this plant phenology indicator in just a moment. And so here we have, this is dormant. It's dormant season, March, early April, where we don't have a whole lot of activity yet, but there are certain things that are just starting to come out and be problems. The Cooley spruce gall-adelgid, which is kind of a fun gall that we see on Douglas fir. We want to be treating the immature Cooley spruce gall-adelgids between 22 and 91 growing degree days, so very early on in March. Aphids, 7 and 100 days on deciduous plants. Some of the scales, oh, that one doesn't have anything, never mind. Hemlock scale, which is an important one for nursery growers sometimes, 35 to 121 growing degree days. And so you get the idea. So I can look at my pest and have an understanding of when it's going to be vulnerable to treatments during these windows of growing degree days. Here's one for a little bit later in the year. This is May. So the woolly beech aphid, which is kind of a really neat aphid, it kind of waves around and it's fuzzy. But I'm going to be treating them when they're in the egg stage or the nymphal stage at 363 to 707 growing degree days. It's relatively specific. Tent caterpillars, I'm going to start treating them at about 190 growing degree days. And here's my forest tent caterpillar, 192 to 363 growing degree days. And this is when it's in the caterpillar stage. I can't treat it as an egg, and I can't treat it as an adult. Just isn't effective. And I also need to know that for that insect in particular, the earlier on I treat it, when the caterpillar is still small, I can use less toxic things. If I wait too long and the caterpillar's grown large, it's molted into its fourth instar, I have to use much more toxic chemicals to kill it. A similar insect, the gypsy moth, is out earlier, 90 growing degrees days. And so you do have to have a good understanding of even things that are similar to each other have different timings. This one at the top in May has some plant indicators, phenolic plant indicators. And these are plants that flower at about the same time as these growing degree days are happening. And so when black locust is flowering, which is a relatively common plant and has big chains of white flowers and they kind of smell like bubblegum, they're very nice. When black locust is flowering, I should be treating for a forest tent caterpillar if I feel that my forest tent caterpillar population is problematic. So I can pair up the natural environmental indicator with the growing degree date. Here's one for August. And so this is one when Viburnum dentatum has fruit that are in color. Since we don't have a lot of things that flower late in the season, we're looking at fruiting. If I'm having problems with my locust borers, at 2,271 to 2,805 growing degree days, this would be when I'd want to treat them. And so you can see the growing degree day accumulation happening through the year. This is August, and the windows that I'd need to treat them. And so where do I find this information? And so I'll talk about a text later, which is available online as well as in hard copy, which is Cornell's recommendations for pesticide management. And these lists are included as part of that book. There's another document that you can subscribe to every year. It's called Branching Out, and I'll post the link, or I'll post an issue of this in Blackboard and the link to the previous years. It is a subscription, so you won't be able to access this year's. This is the one that just came out yesterday. And this is a scouting and management newsletter. So there's people across the state who are part of the Cornell Cooperative Extension and Cornell University system that report back what they find. And there's people in key locations around the state, Long Island, Ithaca, upstate, and so we can kind of get an understanding of how things are moving through the state. And they report back what they're seeing, and they're experts, so they can give us often predictions of what we should start to see soon. The second picture here on the right here is a scouting report. And so this is a summary of the things that people are seeing, and there's a few things I'll just point out. And so this first one, the elongate hemlock scale, is a scale you find on hemlock needles, and the number 45 next to that refers to the plate in these books over here, Diseases of Trees and Shrubs and Insects that Feed on Trees and Shrubs. And so hemlock scale is an insect. And so if I go to page, or to plate number 45 in this text, in this book, I can read all about the elongate hemlock scale. And so they don't give you a ton of information about the insect itself, but they reference where you can find it. Not all of them show up in these books, and so you can see this pine mealybug. There isn't a page for that. And sometimes if it's a new insect, or if it's one that's, or a disease that's not really categorized well, we don't have them in the books. The books are static. You know, they were, I think the insect one was last updated 10 years ago. And so not everything is in them, but they're great resources. And so I know we have them in Bicknell. I don't know if Spader has them. I would hope that you do. And if we were in class, I'd pass them around, but sorry about that. And so, but this is an invaluable resource. And so as a manager working with clients, someone calls me and say, hey, I'm starting to see this problem with my magnolia. And I can say, I know what time of year it is. I've read it in my newsletter that this is starting to be an issue. I bet this is what you have. And I don't think I would say it like that, but it can give me a lot of information when working with people on their own pest problems.